Claire Johnson never imagined that by asking for the help of a millionaire, both their fates would change forever. When Arthur Ferris finally discovered the truth about Gabriel, his own choices came to light, and the price to be paid would be much higher than any fortune he had accumulated. The sky was covered with thick clouds, and the rain fell relentlessly over New York City. The downtown streets were drenched, and puddles reflected the flickering streetlights. Under an overpass, amidst the constant sound of raindrops falling and cars passing by, Claire Johnson clutched her worn-out coat to her body. The cold wind bit her skin, and she sought shelter, as she had done almost every day since her life had fallen apart. At 26, Claire had experienced more suffering than most could imagine. Evicted from the neighborhood where she grew up, with no family support and a heart shattered by the loss of her younger brother, Gabriel, she now found herself invisible among the thousands of homeless people struggling to survive in the streets of the big city. Her memories of life before the tragedy haunted her like ghosts. Memories of sunny days playing with Gabriel, carefree conversations in the small house they shared with their mother. The longing was deep, but the uncertainty about her brother's whereabouts was what truly consumed her. Claire looked around, searching for any sign of safety or comfort. The rain had driven people away, leaving the streets almost deserted. That's when something caught her attention. At the foot of a pile of garbage bags, a metallic glint reflected the headlights. Curious, she approached. Beneath a piece of cardboard, partially submerged in a puddle, was a black leather briefcase, far too sophisticated for that part of the city. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the briefcase. Something reminded her of the many times Gabriel, with a determined look, would say, "Never let anything slip, Claire. Life doesn't give us many chances." She swallowed hard and, without thinking any further, grabbed the briefcase, hugging it close to her chest to protect it from the rain. The weight of the briefcase suggested its contents were important. Claire ran to the entrance of a small abandoned store, the only place offering some protection from the storm. Under the concrete canopy, she knelt and opened the briefcase. The smell of wet leather filled the air as her fingers ran over the latches. Inside, there were neatly organized stacks of papers, contracts, and documents with the name Arthur Ferris boldly stamped on the first pages. She frowned at the name. "I've heard this name before," she thought. Arthur Ferris was behind some of the biggest real estate developments that had turned entire neighborhoods into ruins. His company had been responsible for the removal of several families from areas where new skyscrapers were built, evicting them without warning. Could he have had something to do with what happened to us? Claire's eyes narrowed as she flipped through the papers. There wasn't much time to read carefully, but what she saw made her shudder. These were crucial documents, papers that could be worth millions, maybe even more. She found herself in an immediate dilemma. Should she simply return the briefcase? What would she gain from that? Perhaps a modest reward, some fleeting recognition. But at that moment, something deeper awakened in her. Since Gabriel's disappearance, Claire had never had a solid lead on where he might be. She knew deep in her heart that he was still alive. People from the outskirts often disappeared, usually swallowed up by slave labor schemes or exploited by companies taking advantage of the most vulnerable. Now holding Arthur Ferris's documents in her hands, she felt that, for the first time in a long time, she had a card to play, a real chance to turn the tables in her favor. But how could she possibly speak to someone so powerful and unreachable? He wouldn't take a homeless woman like me seriously, she thought. However, that line of thinking was soon replaced by a new resolve. Claire knew that this man desperately needed those documents, and she knew he would listen to her if he wanted to avoid a financial disaster. She closed the briefcase, her mind already formulating a plan. But what would she ask in return? She didn't want money. That wasn't the kind of thing that would solve her problems. She wanted something far more important, something that no amount of Arthur's fortune could buy directly. Information. She wanted him to use his power and influence to help find Gabriel. Claire knew that men like Arthur had access to things beyond the reach of ordinary people. He could open doors she could never get through. This was her chance, maybe her only one, to reunite with her brother. The rain continued to pour, heavy and relentless, but Claire didn't care. With the briefcase firmly in her hands, she walked through the wet streets with a new sense of purpose. What she didn't know was that this unlikely encounter would change not only her life, but also Arthur Ferris's in ways neither of them could ever predict. The days that followed were a whirlwind of anxiety and preparation for Claire Johnson. She knew she couldn't just show up at Arthur Ferris's doorstep, the magnate whose name was stamped on the documents. She was a homeless woman, invisible to the eyes of New York's elite. No one would even let her through the front desk of one of his luxurious buildings. However, Claire was clever, and her determination to find Gabriel outweighed any obstacles. She spent her nights trying to devise a plan. Her contacts on the streets, small vendors who knew every corner of the city, began to mobilize. One of them, a newsstand owner named John, was particularly helpful. He had a friend who worked at the reception of one of the buildings where Arthur kept his office. After some conversations and exchanged favors, Claire managed to get what she needed, the direct number to Arthur Ferris's office. That morning, Claire found herself standing before a rusty payphone, her heart racing. With the briefcase stashed in a safe place, she dialed the number with trembling fingers. When a woman's voice answered, professional and distant, Claire took a deep breath. "Arthur Ferris's office. How can I help you?" the secretary asked. Claire hesitated for a second before forcing her voice to sound firm. "I need to speak with Mr. Ferris. It's about some documents that belong to him, important things he lost." On the other end of the line, there was a brief silence. Claire could imagine the secretary wondering whether to pass the call along. This is New York, she thought. Everyone's used to absurd offers and requests. The pause lasted only a few seconds, but felt like an eternity. "May I take your name and number? We'll be in touch if necessary." "No," Claire responded immediately, her voice hardening. "That's not how this is going to work. Either he meets me in person, or these papers disappear forever. I won't give more details. He knows what I'm talking about." The threat worked. The secretary's tone changed, and with a slightly more urgent edge, she asked, "Where can we meet you?" Claire gave the address of a small diner downtown, a discreet place, but public enough to avoid trouble. She knew she was taking a risk by exposing herself, but there was no other way. As soon as she hung up the phone, a wave of immediate relief washed over her, quickly followed by the apprehension of what would happen next. Hours later, Claire was sitting in a corner of the diner, staring out the window while absent-mindedly stirring a cup of cold coffee. The environment around her was filled with workers coming and going for quick meals. She watched everything carefully, knowing Arthur Ferris wouldn't come alone. The millionaire would undoubtedly bring security. He'd be prepared for any trap. And he appeared, just as she had imagined, impeccably dressed, in a perfectly tailored suit, sharply contrasting with the setting around him. Two tall, muscular bodyguards flanked him, one on either side, like lethal shadows. Claire had to stifle a wry smile. She, a homeless woman, had caused so much discomfort for one of the most powerful men in America. Arthur entered the diner with an air of exhaustion and distrust. His eyes swept the room before finally landing on Claire. There was thinly veiled surprise on his face as he realized the woman who had forced him out of his luxurious office was so young and seemingly harmless. Nevertheless, he didn't underestimate the situation. He undoubtedly thought he was being blackmailed. Claire stood up slowly, keeping her gaze fixed on Arthur. The bodyguard stepped forward, but she raised her hand, stopping them. "No need for that," she said calmly, her eyes locked on Arthur. "I just want to talk." Arthur gave a slight nod, signaling the bodyguards to stand back but remain alert. He approached Claire's table, and the contrast between the two couldn't have been more striking. He was imposing, the owner of a fortune built with a combination of determination and coldness. She was vulnerable on the outside, but with an inner strength he didn't yet comprehend. "You have something that belongs to me," Arthur said, cutting straight to the point. His voice was firm, but there was a tone of impatience. Clearly, he wanted to resolve the issue as quickly as possible and move on with his life. Claire nodded. "I do. But you're not here to negotiate money." Arthur narrowed his eyes, crossing his arms. "Then what do you want? And be clear. I don't have patience for games." She held his gaze for a long moment before speaking. "I don't want your money, Mr. Ferris. What I want is for you to help me find my brother. He disappeared 3 years ago, and I believe you have the means to discover where he is." Arthur blinked, surprised. It wasn't the response he had expected, and the confusion on his face gave him away. "Your brother, I don't know what you're talking about. His name is Gabriel. He was working as a construction assistant at a site until he disappeared without a trace. I've tried everything, went to the police, searched on my own. Nothing but you." She hesitated for a second, gathering her courage. "You have resources, connections with companies of all kinds, even those that use forced labor. I believe you can find him, and that's what I want in exchange for your documents." The impact of her request was immediate. Arthur's expression shifted, his face taking on a seriousness that Claire hadn't anticipated. He stepped back as if trying to process what he had just heard. The bodyguards exchanged glances, not understanding what was happening. Arthur sat down in the chair opposite Claire, looking directly at her, his voice now quieter and filled with an emotional weight he hadn't shown in years. "You're asking me to turn my world upside down, my companies, in search of someone I've never met. Why?" he asked, his voice faltering slightly. "Because I have nothing left," Claire replied. "And you have everything. You can fix what your world destroyed." Arthur remained silent, something inside him beginning to unravel. A troubling truth hit him hard, a truth he had been ignoring for years. His fortune, his empire, what he had built, all of it was founded on stories like Claire's, and then, unexpectedly, he began to cry. Arthur Ferris, the ruthless man who never hesitated in a negotiation, sat across from Claire Johnson with tears streaming down his face. The silent tears slid down his cheeks, as if years of guilt and pain had finally found a way to escape. He hadn't cried since the death of his wife, Aunt Sarah, 3 years ago. Since that tragic accident, he had buried his emotions deep within himself, hiding behind stacks of contracts and millions of dollars. But now, confronted by a young woman who wasn't asking for money but the truth he had avoided for so long, his emotions erupted in an overwhelming wave. Claire, for her part, watched silently, not looking away despite her surprise at Arthur's reaction. She hadn't expected this. Her plan was simple: negotiate, get help, and find Gabriel. But seeing such a powerful man break down in front of her stirred something deep within. For a moment, the homeless woman wasn't invisible anymore. She had touched an open wound that Arthur had never healed. The minutes that followed were filled with silence. Arthur wiped his face quickly, trying to regain his composure. He didn't want to seem weak, especially not in front of a woman he had just met. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, hoarse. "I don't know where to start," Arthur said, the words stumbling out. All of this, the way you confronted me, made me realize that—" He paused, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not a good man, Claire. I built my life by destroying others, but I never really looked at the consequences. I never stopped to think about how many families, like yours, Key, were torn apart because of my decisions. Until now." Claire remained silent, but something in Arthur's tone indicated that he was opening up in a way few had ever seen. "When I lost my wife, I thought I'd never feel something as painful again, but I see now that pain isn't just ours. It's everywhere. I ignored it for too long." Arthur took a deep breath, looking exhausted but determined to continue. "I'm going to help you. I don't know what I'll find, but I'll do everything I can. Gabriel, I'll find your brother, no matter the cost." Claire felt the weight of his words. It was the first time in years that someone had promised to help her, genuinely, without an ulterior motive. Still, part of her remained skeptical. She had seen up close how power and money corrupted promises, how men like Arthur manipulated everything around them to keep their lives untouched. "Are you sure?" she asked with a hint of bitterness. "Because, for me, this isn't just another transaction. My brother, he's everything I have. If you're saying you'll help, I need to believe it's real." Arthur nodded without hesitation this time. "I promise." He leaned forward, his eyes locked on Claire's. "I'll start today." Despite the encouraging words, the meeting ended on a somber note. Arthur stood up, his eyes heavy with guilt and responsibility. Before leaving, he looked at Claire one more time, as if wanting to say something more, but he held back. Turning away, his security guards followed him out of the diner, and his figure soon disappeared into the bustling city. Claire sat there for a few more minutes, alone. She felt a mix of relief and tension. The millionaire had promised to help, but now, all that remained was to wait and see if a man so powerful would truly keep his word. Her heart told her something important had changed, but her mind was still clouded with doubt. As Arthur walked through the crowded streets, something stirred inside him. He had never felt so vulnerable. Since Sarah's death, he had shielded himself from any emotion, from any human connection. His empire was all that remained. And now, that woman, a stranger from a world he barely knew, had broken through his defenses with just a few words. Upon entering the car that awaited him, he grabbed his phone and called his trusted assistant, Paul, a man who had worked for him for over a decade. Paul was efficient, discreet, and, most importantly, knew every dark corner of the company's operations. "I need you to investigate something for me," Arthur said, his voice firmer than he expected. "Remember the construction site in South Bronx 3 years ago? Gabriel Johnson, construction assistant. I want to know everything about him, where he worked, with whom, and what happened to him." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Paul hesitated. "Mr. Ferris, I've heard that name before. I looked into it about 2 years ago, but the case was closed. The boy disappeared, and we never found anything. No concrete leads." Arthur remained silent for a moment, but determination began to take hold of his mind. "Reopen the case. I don't care how long it takes or how much money it costs. I want answers, Paul. I want this resolved." Sensing the seriousness in Arthur's tone, Paul quickly agreed. "Understood, sir. I'll start immediately." As he hung up the phone, Arthur gazed out of the car window. The city of New York unfolded before him, towering buildings, overcrowded avenues, a scene of progress and inequality side by side. He knew that what he was about to discover might not be pretty, and perhaps it was too late to make up for all the wrong he had done. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something right. Across the city, Claire walked back to the overpass where she had made a small corner her refuge. The cold wind bit her face, but she hardly noticed. The meeting with Arthur had left her emotions on edge. Part of her wanted to believe that he would keep his word, but life had taught her to be cautious. She sat on the cold ground, hugging her knees as she stared at the dark sky. There were no stars that night, only the grey mantle of heavy clouds. Everything felt so distant, so uncertain. But now, perhaps for the first time in a long time, she had a spark of hope. A small spark, but real. The weeks that followed brought a change in Claire Johnson's life. It wasn't a visible transformation. She still walked the streets in the same way, slept under the overpass, and fought for the bare necessities. But now, something had shifted deeply inside her. Arthur Ferris's promise weighed on her heart like an unsolved mystery. She didn't know if he would keep his word, but despite everything, she felt different, stronger. There was a quiet anticipation that colored her days. She spent her afternoons watching the city move around her, trying to hold on to the hope that somehow this journey would lead her back to her brother. Gabriel had been missing for so long that Claire sometimes wondered if she still remembered the sound of his voice or the way he smiled. The idea that he might still be alive was what kept her standing, even though time had eroded part of her certainty. Meanwhile, Arthur was immersed in a frantic search. Every meeting, every encounter with his lawyers or business partners was interrupted by the relentless thought, "Where is Gabriel?" He obsessively dedicated himself to trying to understand how the young man had disappeared. The investigation he had tasked Paul with was gaining momentum quickly, but the answers were scarce and hard to find. Over the past 3 years, Gabriel's name had vanished from any official record. No relevant clues, no trace. Paul, during one of his regular phone calls with Arthur, brought daily updates, but frustration grew with each passing day. "Mr. Ferris, we've tried to track down the contractors involved in that project, But many of them no longer exist, Paul explained. His voice filled with exhaustion. Most of the records have disappeared. Some of these companies were set up temporarily for quick contracts and then dissolved. Arthur sighed heavily on the phone, feeling the weight of the situation growing heavier by the minute. He wondered if it was too late. With every lead that turned into a dead end, his sense of guilt intensified. How many Gabriels had slipped through the cracks while I focused on building my empire? It was a question he avoided answering because he knew the answer wouldn't be pleasant. However, something about Gabriel's case troubled him on a deeper level. Paul had mentioned that some of those companies were being investigated for involvement in forced labor and worker exploitation under conditions akin to slavery. Arthur had always known, on some level, that these practices occurred on the fringes of his business, but he had never paid enough attention. Now, everything was in the open, and he couldn't ignore it anymore. Finally, on a clear morning after weeks of silence, Arthur received a call from Paul, his voice grave but carrying a hint of urgency. "Sir, we have a lead," Paul said. "One of the workers from that project has been located in a community near the original site. He's willing to talk to us." Arthur seized the opportunity immediately. He remembered Claire's face and the anguish in her eyes when she mentioned Gabriel. The chance to resolve this was now his priority. Hours later, he found himself in a forgotten part of the city, where the skyscrapers and luxury buildings were nothing but distant dreams. Paul accompanied him as they walked through narrow alleys and poorly lit streets. The man they were about to meet was known as Tiao, a construction worker who had worked on that project 3 years ago. Tiao was waiting for them at the entrance to an improvised workshop, where he repaired small household appliances. He was a strong man, with calloused hands and skin weathered by the sun. His eyes carried the exhaustion not just from hard work, but from the difficult life he led. When he saw Arthur, his eyes gleamed with a mixture of recognition and resentment. "I know who you are," Tiao said bluntly as he wiped his hands on a dirty rag, "but I didn't expect someone like you to come looking into this. People like you don't care about things like this." Arthur took a deep breath, knowing this conversation wouldn't be easy. "I know you must have a lot of resentment toward me, and rightfully so. I'm here because I need your help. I need to find a young man who disappeared from that project. His name is Gabriel Johnson." Tiao stayed silent for a moment, as if weighing whether it was worth helping. After a long sigh, he finally spoke. "I remember Gabriel. A good kid, hard-working. But one day he just vanished. We weren't told anything, he just stopped showing up. And the word around the camp was that something bad had happened." "Something bad?" Arthur asked, his heart racing. "What do you mean by that?" Tiao scratched his head, as if trying to piece together his memories. "There was a group of men who ran the projects. Not directly, of course, but everyone knew they did the dirty work. They worked for the big contractors, the ones who didn't care whether people lived or died. The talk was that Gabriel got involved in something he shouldn't have. He started asking too many questions about the workers' rights, about the wages that weren't being paid, and you know how that ends." The silence that followed was suffocating. Arthur felt a lump in his throat. He knew, deep down, that many of those companies' practices were inhumane. But learning that Gabriel had disappeared because he was fighting for fair working conditions brought an overwhelming sense of pain. "So, you think he was taken by those people?" Arthur asked, his voice faltering. Tiao nodded slowly. "I don't have proof, but that's what we heard. Some of the guys talked about a truck that showed up at night. They took some of the workers. They said it was to other projects, but no one who went ever came back." Arthur's breathing grew heavy. He felt a mix of anger and despair swelling inside him. Gabriel, a young man who only wanted better working conditions, had been swallowed by a system Arthur had helped feed. "Do you think he's still alive?" Arthur asked, his voice almost a whisper. Tiao shrugged, his expression lacking much hope. "I don't know, sir, but if he is, he's in a place no one wants to be." Arthur thanked Tiao for the information, but as he walked away, he felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. He returned to his car, thinking about the woman he had promised to help. How could he look Claire in the eyes and tell her that her brother might be in some unreachable place in the hands of people who exploited the lives of the poor? The reality was that the answer he was searching for might be devastating. But at the same time, Arthur knew there was still a chance to, however small, of finding Gabriel alive. He had to do more. He had to go further, confront whoever was behind this. And from that moment on, Arthur Ferris prepared himself for a battle more personal than any negotiation he had faced before. Arthur couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness that had accompanied him since the conversation with Tiao. Returning to his office in downtown New York, he sat in his leather chair, staring at the towering buildings in front of him. From the outside, it looked like he had everything: power, money, influence. But on the inside, everything seemed to be falling apart. The promise he had made to Claire Johnson echoed in his mind: "I will find your brother, no matter the cost." Now, he knew that this promise was much harder to keep than he had ever imagined. Gabriel wasn't just another name lost among thousands of invisible workers. He was a victim of a system that Arthur, even indirectly, had helped perpetuate. And what Tiao had said about the truck that took the men, about the dark fate of those who asked too many questions, kept playing over and over in Arthur's mind. There was a hidden network of exploitation and violence in the shadows of construction sites, and he was determined to uncover the truth, even if it meant battling his own partners and the empire he had built. "Paul," Arthur called out, gripping the phone tightly. "I want you to go all the way with this. Find out who these men are, who controls these operations. We're not just talking about a simple investigation of a missing worker anymore. I want names, locations. I want to know who is behind these networks." Paul hesitated for a moment before responding. "Mr. Ferris, this could be dangerous. The people involved in this are not easy to deal with. We're talking about illegal operations, about people who prefer to keep these things in the dark." Arthur sighed, understanding the implications of what he was asking. But it was too late to turn back now. "I don't care, Paul. Do whatever it takes. Just bring me results." In the days that followed, the search intensified. Arthur used all his connections to try to locate those responsible for the illegal operations among the contractors who had hired Gabriel. He knew he was stirring up a hornet's nest, and with every clue that emerged, he felt he was getting closer to something bigger, something that could bring down not just part of his empire, but also expose a criminal network of exploitation. There were contracts he had signed with companies that benefited from the precariousness of labor. Now, every document he reviewed seemed to carry the weight of the pain of hundreds of workers like Gabriel. Meanwhile, Claire was also facing her own challenges. She continued living on the streets, but now with a sense of urgency. Each day that passed without news of Gabriel gnawed at her. The uncertainty about what Arthur was really doing, whether he was seriously following through on his promise or just using empty words, made her question everything. Skepticism, an old companion of her life on the streets, still lingered. "Men like him don't change," she kept repeating to herself, trying to protect herself from another disappointment. But at the same time, something inside Claire kept a flicker of hope alive. It was a small spark, almost invisible, but it was there. And that spark grew every time she thought about what might happen if Gabriel were really found. The fear of discovering the truth was immense, but the need for answers was even greater. Finally, after weeks of intense searching, Arthur received a phone call from Paul that changed everything. "Mr. Ferris, we've found something," Paul said, his voice urgent. "But it's not good news." Arthur, in the middle of a meeting, immediately stepped out of the conference room, his heart pounding. "Tell me, what did you find?" "We tracked down one of the men who worked in these operations. He was responsible for selecting who would be taken for the harsher jobs. According to him, Gabriel was transferred to an illegal construction site on the state border in a remote area. And," Paul paused for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully, "the conditions there were inhumane. Forced labor, no external contact. It's believed that many of the men taken there didn't survive." The brutal reality of Paul's words hit Arthur like a punch to the gut. He closed his eyes, trying to process what that meant. Gabriel, Claire's brother, had probably been taken to a place where hope didn't exist, a place where men were treated like disposable machines, and now the only certainty was that if Gabriel was still alive, he was in a very dark place. "I'm going there," Arthur said, his voice firm. "Tell me where it is, and I'll go personally." Paul hesitated again. "Sir, I don't think it's safe. These people don't like visitors. If they find out you're digging into this, there could be consequences." "I don't care about the consequences," Arthur replied, feeling the anger growing inside him. "I promised her I'd find her brother, and I'll see this through to the end. Get everything ready, I'll be there tomorrow morning." Hanging up the phone, Arthur felt the weight of his decision. He knew he was taking a risk, perhaps more than ever. But something inside him had changed. For the first time in years, he was putting someone else's well-being above his own interests, and that drove him forward, no matter what happened next. That same night, Arthur paid an unexpected visit to Claire. He found her sitting on a park bench, her gaze lost in the darkness. When she saw him, she quickly stood up, a mixture of surprise and expectation in her eyes. "Did you find something?" she asked immediately, her voice filled with both hope and fear. Arthur nodded, stepping closer to her. "Yes, I did, but it's not good news." Claire's face paled, and she took a step back, as if bracing for the blow that was coming. Gabriel was taken to an illegal construction site. The conditions there were horrible. Many of the men who were sent there didn't come back. But I'm going there, personally. I'll find out what happened to him. I need you to trust me, Claire. This isn't over yet. Arthur's words cut through Claire's heart like a knife. She had always known the truth could be painful, but hearing it, spoken so directly, was still a shock. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, silent tears began to roll down her face. The pain of imagining her brother trapped in that place, suffering with no one to help him, was almost unbearable. Seeing the despair in her eyes, Arthur took a step forward and, without thinking, pulled her into an embrace. Claire, who had spent so long emotionally guarding herself, allowed herself to break down for a brief moment. Her sobs were silent, but each tear seemed to carry years of suffering. "I promise I won't stop until we get answers," Arthur whispered, still holding Claire. Though his words were sincere, both knew that what lay ahead would be the greatest challenge of their lives. A dangerous, uncertain journey, but one that could finally bring the answers Claire had been longing for. The day dawned cloudy, with a thick layer of fog covering the horizon. Arthur Ferris, inside a black SUV, was on his way to the location Paul had indicated. The roads grew bumpier as the vehicle advanced toward more remote areas, far from the urban sprawl of New York. Beside him, Paul typed frantically on his phone, checking information about the illegal construction site, a dark stain on the vast map of the country's real estate operations. Arthur stared out the window, trying to calm his mind. Inside him was a mix of feelings, the tension of the unknown, the anger over the injustice he had allowed to flourish in his empire, and above all, a fierce determination to fulfill the promise he had made to Claire Johnson. He had said he would find Gabriel, and nothing would stop him now. No matter how deep he had to dig, he would get to the bottom of this story. After hours of traveling, they finally reached a dirt road isolated by dense bushes and abandoned buildings. There were no signs of human life, only the distant sound of the wind rustling through the trees. The place looked desolate, a perfect setting to hide illegal activities far from prying eyes. "This is it, sir," Paul said, pointing to a cluster of makeshift shacks and structures in the middle of nowhere. "They call this a construction site, but it looks more like a prison. Men are brought here to work, and many never leave." Arthur took a deep breath before stepping out of the car. The muddy ground clung to his expensive shoes, but he didn't care. The heavy, humid air made his breathing feel labored, but his resolve didn't waver. He knew he was about to face something much larger than just a business problem. As they walked toward the structures, a group of rough-looking men appeared, blocking their path. They were big, with hardened expressions, the kind of security that made it clear this place didn't want visitors. Paul stepped forward to intervene, but Arthur stopped him, taking the lead. "My name is Arthur Ferris," he said, his voice firm and controlled. "I'm here to speak to whoever runs this place. I'm not leaving without answers." The men exchanged glances before one of them, apparently the leader, broke into a mocking grin. "Ferris, The big businessman. "What are you doing here in the middle of nowhere? This isn't your territory." "I'm here for the brother of a woman," Arthur responded, not breaking eye contact. "His name is Gabriel Johnson. He was brought here, and I want to know what happened to him." The man crossed his arms, looking Arthur over as if deciding how serious he was. After a few tense seconds, he motioned to the others, signaling that they could pass. "Go ahead," the leader said with a sadistic smile. "But I warn you, the answers you find here might not be the kind you want to hear." Arthur kept his gaze steady, showing no fear. He knew this place was involved in terrible things, but he also knew that once he stepped foot there was no turning back. Paul stayed by his side as they moved through the grounds, his eyes alert to any sign of danger. What they saw inside was much worse than anything Arthur had imagined. Thin, exhausted men worked in unsanitary conditions, some with visible injuries, all with empty, hopeless expressions. It was as if they were trapped in an endless cycle of pain and exploitation. Few words were exchanged, and the oppressive silence filled the air. Arthur felt a lump in his throat, but he forced himself to keep going. After walking through several shacks, they arrived at a small cabin where the supervisors of the site seemed to operate. Inside was an older man, grey-haired and with a harsh expression, sitting at a desk. He was the one in charge of the site. "Gabriel Johnson," Arthur said, cutting straight to the point. "What happened to him?" The man, clearly used to dealing with desperate people, looked at Arthur with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. "Gabriel Johnson, that's been a while. He was a stubborn kid, always asking questions. That's not good for business." "Where is he?" Arthur pressed, the tension rising in his voice. The man shrugged. "Maybe he left. Maybe he died. Things are unpredictable here. If they can't handle it, they just drop. And those who drop don't get back up." Anger exploded inside Arthur. He stepped forward, gripping the edge of the desk. "I didn't come here for excuses. You know what happened to him. I can destroy you and this place with one phone call, and you know it. So tell me the truth now." The man stared at Arthur for a long moment before sighing. Gabriel was taken. Yes, he didn't fit in here. He tried to help the others, but he ended up being seen as a problem. So they sent him to another site farther away. I don't know if he's still alive, but if he is, he's with other men like him, trapped somewhere more isolated. Arthur felt a hollowness in his stomach. It wasn't the answer he had hoped for, but it wasn't the end of the road either. There was still a chance, however small. Without wasting any more time, he turned to Paul. "Get everything organized. We're going after him." Back in the city, Claire waited anxiously for news. The silence was consuming her, and the fear of the unknown made her thoughts spin in circles. When she finally received Arthur's message, her heart raced. What had he discovered? They met again at the same park where it had all begun. Arthur, exhausted and visibly shaken, approached her with a somber yet determined expression. He told Claire everything he had uncovered, the terrible conditions at the site, the possibility that Gabriel might still be alive but trapped somewhere else. "I'm going to keep looking," Arthur said, trying to convey some hope. "There's still a chance. I know it's not the complete answer you wanted, but I promise I won't stop until we find him." Claire, though devastated by the news, held Arthur's gaze. She knew that despite everything, he had done his best. And most importantly, he hadn't given up. "I believe you," she said, her voice firm though trembling with emotion, "and thank you for everything." Arthur felt the weight of her words, a mix of relief and pain. He knew the journey ahead would still be long, but something had changed within him, and this journey was no longer just about finding Gabriel. It was about redemption, about fixing what had been broken in his life and the lives of so many others. As they stood in silence for a moment, watching the city around them, Arthur realized that, despite all his flaws, there was still a chance to do something right, and he wouldn't waste that opportunity. If you liked the story, consider subscribing to our channel and supporting us through the thanks button. See you next time.